Let's go to our studios in downtown Toronto. We're very happy to have Canada's former Foreign Affairs Minister, Peter MacKay, joining us with his take on this whole story, this drama of sorts. Always good to have you on the program. What do you make of this?
Thank you, Todd. Well, in spite of what the finance minister has said, this is a major blow, not just to the Liberal government for partisan reasons, but major blow to the economy, to the energy sector in particular. I suspect that this is a bad day for Rachel Notley. And it's pretty hard to put lipstick on this pig. It's going to hurt in a lot of ways. And another concern that has to be stated, Todd, is the reputational damage that this does to Canada as a place to invest, as a place that seemingly can't get projects done, can't move its energy, can't proceed with natural resources projects. This is a very serious setback that the federal appeal court has dealt our country today.
Kinder Morgan filed that application 5 years ago to have this twinned. Is it ever going to get built now? I mean, people are trying to follow the trajectory here, sort of up and down and left and right, back and forth. What do you think?
I think it's very unlikely now that we're going to see this project proceed in any sense in the near future, if at all. There has been a full court press for some time now, as you mentioned, by environmental groups, Indigenous groups. The province of BC weighed in through this court challenge. And yes, there is an appeal process now open to the federal government, which they can exercise. But I think they're going to have to explore other options. I have a stated bias on this, but perhaps revisiting the Energy East project is something they should be looking at. Because we're landlocked, because we can't get oil and gas to market, to Tidewater, to refine it. It seems increasingly that Canada has put itself at a very competitive disadvantage, where we're relying on other countries to bring us energy sources to heat our homes, to move products, to move about. It's a very bizarre situation for a superpower energy country like Canada to be constricted in its ability to develop its own natural resources.
We were listening to the current leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, earlier today, Mr. MacKay, and he was saying, that blame should be shared equally between the current Trudeau government and the previous Harper government, which is where this whole project started, especially considering the federal court said that the National Energy Board's process was flawed to begin with back when this all began. Is blame equally shared in your mind?
Well, I think there's always an effort to point the finger back at prior governments. Every government does it. But I think it is a bit ironic that the current government, who pride themselves on consultation and they were making it a central plank of their government's platform to improve relations with First Nations, to consult in a much more inclusive and broad way, that has been completely repudiated by the Federal Court of Appeal. So try as they might to go back a number of years, this is on them. This process was one that they had shepherded over the last almost 3 years, and the federal court has said it was flawed, they didn't do enough, and it's back to the drawing board. So there's also an irony that the approval of the Kinder Morgan pipeline that is now owned by Canadian taxpayers is approved on this day when the project is told that it will not go ahead.
Yeah, you raise a great point. I want to dig into something deeper that you mentioned a moment ago, which was this notion that this is a project which was going to send a message out there to international investors that Canada is, quote unquote, open for business. Now you're saying that as a result of this and the ongoing drama we've seen over the past 5 years is sending a very different message to international investors?
Very much so, that these type of projects, and of course, let's not forget that we have an infrastructure bank that really has very little to show for the investments that were going to be made to help jumpstart the economy and get Canadians working. Very little to show in that particular category. But a pipeline such as this, which could be and should be a nation-building enterprise, one that would connect our natural resource sector, that would create jobs east and west, and I come back to this East Coast pipeline as a much more viable option perhaps now. But the way in which the federal government has handled this, the way in which that they have delayed and put further regulatory processes in place, has to be a contributing factor. to the reality, which is we're not building pipelines. We're not exporters of oil and gas. And we're increasingly faced with the competition now south of the border. And we could talk at length about what's happening with NAFTA, but we are now almost entirely, if not entirely, reliant on the Americans to take our oil and gas. We haven't been able to diversify our markets and get it to the Asia Pacific or to get it to Europe, who are hungry for clean, ethical Canadian oil and gas. And instead, we are importers, net importers of oil and gas from places like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Algeria, where we criticize and hector them for their human rights records, and yet we're reliant on them in order to keep the lights on in some of these Canadian households and to keep businesses moving. So we've really, in my opinion, put Canada in a bad place in terms of our economy, in terms of our competitiveness, and in terms of our reputation. Direct foreign investment is dropping off and capital is fleeing our country as a result, further result of this decision today.
One last thing, you mentioned NAFTA, so I want to get your read on that, because that's the other big story we're following today, the Trans Mountain here in Canada, but the NAFTA negotiations in Washington. And we're trying to figure out how this is all going to play out. Realistically, what does Canada need to offer up here in order to get a deal that is a so-called win-win-win for all of the countries involved?
Well, I don't think there's going to be a win-win-win. I think two countries are going to win and one is going to lose and is going to have to make concessions, and that's Canada. I suspect we're going to give up some points on the dairy supply managed system. We're going to have to make some concessions there. As we have previously, there's precedent for that with CETA. But what amount that will be and how it will affect Canadian dairy farmers, we'll wait to see. The devil will be in that detail. Secondly, Chapter 19 and the way that disputes are settled is also something the Americans have been very critical of. And we saw the importance of that yesterday on a decision out of the Commerce claims that Canadians were acting improperly in subsidizing our paper industry, as they have with softwood and other industries. So that dispute resolution mechanism, critically important. A prior Conservative government under Brian Mulroney walked away over that very subject and then was able to get it back on the table. But they're pushing us very hard. They had 5 weeks of just the Mexicans in the room, and now they're allowing Canada back in for 3 days with an artificial deadline for Friday. So it's possible we come out with something tomorrow. There will inevitably be an approval process. It could be an agreement in principle that will have to then bump along for another 30 days or so. But we have been at a disadvantage in many ways in how this has played out. We've been bullied. And I think that the divide and conquer, getting Mexico to agree before us, has also taken away a lot of our leverage.
Peter MacKay, Canada's former Foreign Affairs Minister in the Conservative government. Always good to have you on the program, Mr. MacKay, and thank you for doing this today, getting to our studios.
My pleasure, Todd. Thank you.
All right, as Peter was talking about, of course, we're following the very latest in Washington. What is going to happen with NAFTA? What is not going to happen with NAFTA? The American capital, very much ground zero for these trade talks. Canadian officials are trying to come up with a deal for a revamped version, but there is this deadline that Donald Trump has called out, Friday, artificial or otherwise. Canada needs to get on board or risk being cut out. Could be bluster and rhetoric, but it is definitely out there and probably helping to focus some of the minds here that are working in Washington, including our Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who continues to say there's been progress, but a whole lot of hard work remains. Listen to this.
That's the sort of intense rhythm characteristic for this stage of the negotiations. The atmosphere is good. There is goodwill on both sides, and I'm encouraged by that.
Chrystia Freeland has been back and forth in Washington. These are some live pictures coming in here with her latest statement. Let's listen in.
Thank them for the close collaboration. The fact that Canada has a typical Canadian approach is very important for these negotiations.
It is good to see you all. Together with the Prime Minister and Ambassador McNaughton and Minister Dominic LeBlanc, our Minister for Intergovernmental Relations. We had a very good call with the premiers of Canada's provinces and territories to give them an update and to hear their views on the negotiations. I would really like to thank the premiers for their very productive contribution to these negotiations. The fact that we've been able to have throughout a real Team Canada approach has been really, really important for our country. As I said, I'm going in now to continue our negotiations with Ambassador Lighthizer. And when we're done, I'll come out and tell you what happened. Thanks.
Did you tell the Premier that...
All right, so a very brief comment there from Chrystia Freeland, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, as she is heading back into the building there. You can see Ambassador McNaughton is joining her along the way. I'm wondering if she's asking or answering a few other questions here. This is a very fluid situation here. Chrystia Freeland holds numerous press conferences during the day here. You can see the media all camped out in front of the building where they are negotiating. Basically, Freeland saying that the conference call has just ended between herself, the Prime Minister, and the premiers of all of Canada's provinces and territories as we try to figure out how this is all going to play out. I want to bring back in Peter MacKay, who is Canada's former Foreign Affairs Minister. Of course, he held that portfolio. Chrystia Freeland is now the minister responsible. It's interesting, you know, Chrystia Freeland continues to try to say, you know, there's optimism, I'm hopeful, which I guess is what she sort of has to say, correct?
She has to say that, and clearly there's still a lot of volatility around the issue itself, the president being the wild card in all of it, to say the least. So, yeah, she needs to project confidence. She needs to thank premiers. I think everyone recognizes that what's hanging here in the balance is the most important trading relationship on the planet. And Canada, in particular, is extremely reliant on the successful outcome of this trade negotiation in order for us to secure a better, more prosperous future. There's so many technical elements to all of this discussion, as we know. What we're not hearing from the Canadian government is much talk about the progressive elements that they had put on the table at the very early days of these negotiations. We're now into much more important issues around the economy as opposed to some of the more domestic, prosaic issues that are, yes, important, but seem to have been rebuffed by the Americans in this negotiation.
If we can cut through the spin for a moment that, you know, we often hear from different politicians who are involved in this process, can I ask you, I mean, what sort of cards do we actually have to play from the Canadian side of things?
Well, one of the more important cards is that there is tremendous support from governors, from chambers of commerce, from industry in the United States for this to be a trilateral agreement. They have seen the incredible success of NAFTA over the last 25 plus years. They know that there is benefits that flow to all three countries. So to that extent, to have this ratified in the U.S., most governors, and there is great political capital in having this a three-way deal. Now, is the president swayed by that? Is he concerned about his political fortunes in the upcoming November primaries? Possibly. But this is a president who wants to win at all costs, and some would say. He wants to be able to project power. He wants to be able to say that he has a better deal. And in order to do that, that means getting something from the others, mainly Mexico and Canada. And so that means it's, as you alluded to earlier, it's not necessarily going to be a three-way win, which is how our government, and the spin, of course, is that we're all going to win. It's going to be a modernized, better NAFTA. Well, if it means we're giving the Americans more access to our supply managed system, if it means we're giving up what has been a successful dispute resolution mechanism, we're giving up potential revenues on cars or on goods that are going to be transferred through e-commerce. These are some of the more important, costly elements that hit Canadians in the pocketbook and hit them in the business world in the sense of what their year-end profits may be. And that will be the calculus of whether this has been a successful negotiation.
When we zoom out, and we still don't know how this is going to play out, of course, over the next 24 hours, but do you think that Canada botched the process, or given the volatility of President Trump, was this doomed from the get-go?
I mean, that's a very good question, and you'll get a divergence of opinion. Mine is that in the early days of these discussions, I think the charm offensive by the Trudeau administration was working. You have a tremendous ego and a very thin-skinned president. Where it seemed to go badly awry, and I'm trying to be objective about this, was at the G7. And there was a bilateral that happened where apparently the president was willing to make certain concessions on things like the Sunset Clause and perhaps others, and was seemingly rebuffed. He left the G7, got on a plane. Our prime minister, for perhaps domestic political reasons, was posturing, saying we won't be pushed around. The president took great umbrage to this, called him weak and dishonest, said Canadians would pay. And shortly afterwards, we find ourselves sidelined in these discussions. So it does come back to relationships. Relationships matter. This original agreement would not have been inked were it not for the close personal relationship between Ronald Reagan and, of course, Brian Mulroney. So how the relationships have been managed perhaps is the most important element of whether this negotiation ultimately will succeed. And to that extent, Canadians can judge for themselves.
Peter MacKay, Canada's former Foreign Affairs Minister. Peter, always good to have you, and thank you for taking the time to help quarterback our coverage today.
Thanks again, Tom.